All right, so President Joe Biden is back doing Joe Biden things. The architect of mass incarceration has already been very consistently pushing for record police budgets here in the United States, but now he's trying to go even a step further and is apparently going to be making a speech where he's going to push cities to use already allocated COVID relief funds to expand the police state here in the United States. So here from CBS News or NBC News, they say Biden to urge cities to spend COVID relief money on police and crime prevention. So we're going to go ahead and get into some of the details here, but keep in mind that this is coming at the exact same time as the Biden administration has completely failed to re-up our funding for COVID supplies. As the CDC is predicting, we could see upwards of 100 million Americans get COVID this fall, and we don't have nearly enough resources or equipment to be able to handle that. So we already are strapped for COVID funds, and now he's suggesting that we use this not on anything relating to COVID whatsoever, but instead dumping it into our already absurdly bloated police budgets. So here from NBC News, they say President Joe Biden will urge states and cities to use unspent money from last year's $1.9 trillion COVID relief package to fund crime prevention programs and hire police officers. So they say Biden is expected to stress the need for more public safety programs at an event with mayors and law enforcement officials Friday at the White House. And a number of major cities have reported surges in crime rates since the start of the COVID pandemic. I think that it's important to get a little bit of nuance in here. If you go and look at the individual statistics within major cities, there has been an uptick in violent crime rates, like the homicide rates, for example. But if you go and look at levels of theft and petty crimes, for example, those are not rising to the same degree that we've seen violent crime rising. But nonetheless, there's absolutely no evidence whatsoever that increasing the amount of police that we have on the street or increasing their budgets or giving them more military equipment, as Biden has been doing, there's no substantive evidence whatsoever to prove a correlation there that would somehow lessen crime that's happening here. In fact, I mean, if you were just to objectively look at the size of, for example, the NYPD budget, which is larger than most countries' military budgets, if it was the case that police and police funding had a direct correlation to lowering crime rates, then LA and New York and Chicago would be the safest cities on the planet. But clearly, that's not the case, because this is a completely ineffective way to go about trying to address the issue of crime. But they continue saying the White House said that it is pushing local governments to spend the money before the summer months, where there has historically been more violent crime compared to winter months. And they say at least $10 billion from the American Rescue Plan, which Congress passed in March of 2021, has already been committed to public safety programs, including domestic violence prevention efforts, drug abuse and mental health services, and bonuses for hiring and retaining police officers, the White House said. And again, I wonder where the bulk of this money is going. Is it really going to be going into effective mental health services? No, the vast majority of this is going into reinforcing the power of the police state and giving them, bonuses after they, in 2020, during the George Floyd Breonna Taylor protests, went out and just brutalized people for pushing back against their violence. But they continue with more money here, saying that about $6.5 billion was allocated in 2021 by 300 localities and more than half of states, including $2 billion for crime prevention programs to ease the burden on police, and $1 billion for bonuses to help recruit and retain public safety workers, the White House said. And they say as crime continues to rise in parts of the country, Republicans have sought to make it a key issue in the midterm elections, accusing Democrats of being in favor of defunding police departments. I wish that Democrats were in favor of this. But again, Joe Biden is the architect of mass incarceration. This is a guy who helped author and write the 94 crime bill that led to the situation that we have right now, where the United States has roughly 4% of the world's total population and like 23% of the world's total prison population. So I don't think anybody could possibly be under the delusion that Joe Biden is somehow in favor of defunding the police, or that really any Democrats outside of maybe, Cory Bush and a handful of others, basically none of the Democratic Party has been openly in favor of defunding the police. If anything, they've been as aggressively as possible pushing in the opposite direction, again, pushing for those record police budgets that we're going to get to here in a second. But they say Biden, who has increasingly pushed back against this narrative, maintains that he is for funding the police and has accused Republicans of supporting cuts to the police budgets, citing their opposition to the American Rescue Plan. And they say in his remarks on Friday, Biden will call on states and local communities to spend the COVID relief money on putting more police officers on the beat for accountable community policing, accountability, famously something that we have here in the U.S. Police state. But they say expanding evidence-based community violence intervention programs and preventing crime by making our neighborhoods stronger, whatever the fuck that means. with more educational and economic opportunities. So I wish that that was the case, but of course, when it comes to the actual economic programs that were on the table under the Biden administration so far, basically everything that was intended to get to materially improve the lives of average working class Americans was completely shot down, both by Republicans and by corporate Democrats within the Democratic Party, like Joe Manchin, Kirsten Sinema, etc. They basically prevented every single policy like universal preschool, free community college, expanded Medicare services and Medicaid, lower prescription drug costs, tax cuts for families with children in childcare, 12 weeks paid family leave, etc. You can go down the line. Basically, corporate Democrats and Republicans teamed up to oppose all of the actual material benefits to working class people that could actually have a material effect on lowering the crime rate, because crime is not directly correlated to the amount of police officers that you have under your city's control, or the number of millions or billions of dollars that you are giving to them to spend on fancy new equipment, or the military equipment that the federal government is licensing to them. That has no correlation to crime. What actually does have a direct correlation to crime is things like poverty, and going through a multi-year pandemic that is still ongoing, where millions of people lost their jobs, millions of people lost their family members, are suffering from long-term sickness, etc. All of those things actually play a role in increasing the rates of crime, and yet seems like the vast majority of their focus in this entire thing is going to be on hiring more police officers and then giving them bonuses for the absolutely useless job that they do. But again, this is Joe Biden, so not anything out of the ordinary, not anything that you wouldn't expect. As they say here from the Washington Post, Biden helped to usher in an era of mass incarceration. Can he now end it? Well, I think that we have a pretty definitive answer to that question. No, he doesn't have any intention of ending it. In fact, if anything, he has an intention of expanding the mass incarceration issue that we have right now in the country. But just to give you a perspective in terms of how ridiculous the narrative is surrounding the defunding the police scaremongering that has been pushed by Republicans and Democrats alike, well, here from the New York Times, let's just look at the numbers. They say, despite some cuts, according to a 2021 analysis of police budgets in the nation's 50 largest cities by Bloomberg City Lab, law enforcement spending as a share of general expenditures rose slightly from 13.6% in 2020 to 13.7% in 2021. So increased police spending, you would expect to see a downtick in crime in 2021. Of course, you didn't see that. And of course, they then turned around and blamed defund the police activists as if they didn't just get an increased police budget. But they continue saying even as many cities cut spending in other areas as a result of the COVID pandemic. So they didn't cut the police budgets, but they cut things like healthcare and education and social welfare services that actually would have an impact in raising crime rates. So the exact opposite approach to crime reduction that you would have if you were serious about it. But they continue here saying, and out of 42 major cities where Democrats gained votes from 2016 to 2020, more than half increased police spending for fiscal year 2021, and some cities that cut spending or pledged to cut it later reversed or restored that funding. And they give a couple examples here. In 2020, for example, the New York City's mayor at the time, Bill de Blasio, pledged to cut $1 billion from the police department's $6 billion budget. That's really a low estimate here. But in the end, most of these cuts did not materialize. Instead, de Blasio approved for fiscal year 2022 a $200 million increase in police spending. So again, they weren't defunded, they had their funding increased to record levels. But they continue with another example. City officials in Austin, Texas embarked on a similar journey, cutting the city's police budget during the Floyd protests, reversing those cuts the following year, and then expanding the budget for law enforcement, including for more officers and more training. And this year, the Austin Police Department budget stands at $442 million, a record high. And last year, the mayor of LA, Eric Garcetti, proposed an $11.2 billion budget that increased funding for the LAPD to $1.76 billion for fiscal year 2022 from $1.71 billion for the fiscal year 2021. And in Baltimore, likewise, police funding grew to $555 million for 2022, a $28 million increase from the previous fiscal year. So again, clearly police budgets have not been defunded, and so there's no legitimate argument to be made in blaming the rise in violent crime rates on defunding the police. If anything, you could make a correlative argument and say that you increase the police budgets and you cut all of these other programs like social welfare, like education, like healthcare, etc. You cut all of those other programs that would have materially helped people, and that actually led to an increase in crime rates, along with obviously the economic devastation that people have been feeling during the pandemic. But they continue here with a little bit more editorializing on what this data should be telling us, saying, yes, since the start of the pandemic, there's been an increase increase in violent crime. It has been happening everywhere, in big cities, small towns, in Democratic strongholds and Republican ones, and at the same time, there is no real relationship between crime rates and police budgets. As Philip Bump observed for the Washington Post in 2020, more spending in a year hasn't significantly correlated to less crime or to more crime. For violent crime, in fact, the correlation between changes in crime rates and spending per person in 2018 dollars is almost zero. There is no correlation proving that increased police budgets or increasing police officers' presence in all of these major cities has any effect whatsoever in lowering violent crime rates. But they continue saying, and even if there was a connection, it is not as if there has been a peace dividend for a crime. And cities spend big on police when crime is up, and they spend big on police when crime is down. They spend big when police solve crimes, and they spend big when they don't. In 2020, the Miami-Dade Police Department, one of the largest in the country, resolved or cleared just over 40% of the violent crimes reported in its jurisdiction. 40% success rate. And they say commit a violent crime in Miami-Dade County and you had a roughly 6 in 10 chance of not being caught, at least that year. And despite that low clearance rate, despite a decade of low clearance rates, the budget for the Miami-Dade Police Department has only increased, reaching nearly $800 million for this fiscal year, up from $765 million for 2021 and $707 million for 2020. And finally, he says, in short, there is no pressing national need for greater police funding. If anything, police departments and their allies have skillfully used anxiety over defund to successfully lobby for even larger budgets, despite the striking inability of many police departments to solve crimes and clear murders. So again, this is Joe Biden for you. I mean, not anything that's too surprising if you know the history of who Joe Biden has been for his entire Senate career, but this is Joe Biden leaning into the same problem that he helped to create when he authored the '94 crime bill, the problem of mass incarceration in this country, okay? The problem of over-policing in this country, the hyper-militarization of our police forces in this country. Joe Biden is not defunding the police. He is leaning full-on, full speed in the opposite direction of that and pushing for record police budgets at a time where actual economic material relief to the American people that could have a legitimate effect on lowering crime rates are basically failing at the state levels, the local levels, and at the federal levels under Joe Biden's leadership.